time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
The private dinner was meant to be quiet, controlled, and sealed away from the eyes of the world. But the moment King Charles saw Harry's close friend standing inside the room, everything changed. One glance was enough. The king froze, the conversation stopped, and within minutes, the dinner was cancelled. Not postponed, not delayed. Cancelled with a silence so sharp it exposed a wound the monarchy had tried to hide. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had entered that evening believing he was walking into safety. The private dinner, a closed family meal where only trusted people were meant to gather, had been arranged far from cameras, crowds, and public pressure. He expected calm faces. He expected loyalty. He expected the kind of controlled royal evening where every chair, every name, and every quiet greeting had already been checked. But the king saw one person who did not belong, and the room changed before anyone dared to speak. Camilla noticed it first in his face. She watched the monarch stop so suddenly that the air around him seemed to tighten. The queen consort knew that look. It was not confusion. It was not surprise. It was injury. The friend standing inside that private space was not just a guest. He was a living link to Prince Harry, a son whose distance had become one of the deepest wounds in the House of Windsor, the royal family's historic household and public institution. Charles did not see a man at dinner. He saw a door open to pain. The king asked no friendly question. He gave no polite greeting. His eyes stayed fixed on the friend, and the silence around the table grew heavier with every passing second. Someone had crossed a boundary. Someone had either ignored the palace's private guest rules or tested the patience of the monarch himself. That was what made the moment dangerous. Not the dinner, not the room, the access. Camilla kept still, but she understood that the damage had already begun. The queen consort watched aides exchange glances, and the king's quiet anger became more frightening than any raised voice. Then Charles made the decision that would shake everyone present. He cancelled the private dinner immediately after spotting Harry's close friend inside the room. No delay, no compromise, no soft explanation for those waiting to be seated. William was informed before the last guest had even left. The prince did not respond with shock alone. He responded with cold concern, because he understood what his father's decision meant. The future king knew this was not about one unexpected face. It was about trust inside the palace itself. And before anyone could explain who allowed the friend in, William's reaction made the situation even more dangerous. But to understand why one face could destroy an entire royal evening, the story must turn toward the people standing closest to the wound. Every royal scandal has a public face, but this one began with private emotions. Charles was not simply reacting as a monarch. He was reacting as a father, a wounded man, and a king who believed the walls around him had been crossed. Harry's close friend became more than a guest. In that moment, the friend became a reminder of exile, betrayal, and a son who still haunted the room without being there. Charles carried more than anger that night. He carried years of broken trust, private disappointment, and the pressure of keeping royal gatherings under control after every public wound linked to Harry. A royal gathering, in simple words, is not just a family meal when the monarch is present. It becomes a protected event where access, loyalty, and privacy all matter. The king knew this. He understood that one wrong person in the wrong room could turn a private dinner into a public crisis. Harry's close friend had not arrived as a stranger. Within palace circles, the friend was already known as someone tied to conversations outside royal control, someone who moved near the edges of the family's most painful divide. That made his presence sharper. Charles did not only wonder why the man was there. He wondered who still believed Harry's world had a path back into private royal spaces without permission. Camilla felt the suspicion before anyone said her name. She had not invited the friend, but the queen consort knew how quickly blame travels inside a palace. One glance becomes a question. One silence becomes a verdict. She watched the king's pain harden into authority, and she understood that the evening had stopped being about dinner. It had become about loyalty. William was told privately before the full room understood what had happened. The prince listened carefully as a senior aide explained that the guest had entered before Charles arrived, slipping into the evening before the king could see the danger. That detail changed everything. If the friend came in early, then someone had cleared him. Someone had opened the way. And the future king knew his father would not ignore that. The first quiet confirmation came from an aide who had checked the final dinner list. A dinner list, simply put, is the approved record of who is allowed to attend a private royal event. The aide admitted in a documented internal note that the friend's name was not on the version Charles had approved. That single fact struck like a hidden blade. Charles did not need shouting after that. The king had the answer he feared most. The friend had not merely appeared. The system around the monarch had failed, or worse, someone inside it had chosen to look away. Camilla stayed tense as the silence deepened. William grew colder as the meaning became clear. And that missing name was not a clerical mistake. It was the echo of a trigger that had been waiting to explode. The cancellation did not begin at the dinner table. It began weeks earlier, during a private corridor conversation after a memorial service at St. George's Chapel. Harry's close friend had been seen speaking quietly with a senior palace contact near a side entrance. Charles later heard about it, and from that moment, one question refused to leave him. Was Harry still reaching inside the royal walls? Charles understood why that moment mattered. St. George's Chapel, a royal church often used for weddings, funerals, and major family services, was not just another building connected to the crown. It carried memory, it carried grief, it carried the weight of family history. So when Harry's close friend was seen speaking privately there, after a solemn memorial service, the king felt the place itself had been used as cover for something more dangerous. Harry's close friend did not need to raise his voice to create concern. The quiet conversation was enough. A senior palace contact, meaning a trusted person with access to royal arrangements, had spoken with him near a side entrance away from the main flow of guests. That detail unsettled Charles, because private royal space depends on discipline. If familiar faces could move through those spaces without clear purpose, then the monarch's own home could become uncertain ground. William heard about the corridor meeting through a documented security account later shared inside the family circle. The prince did not explode. He became colder. That was worse. He believed the family had underestimated how long old loyalties could survive after Harry stepped away from royal life. The future king saw the conversation as a warning, not a coincidence, because someone connected to his brother had reached close to the machinery of the palace. Charles felt humiliated when the account reached him. The king had spent months trying to keep family pain separate from royal duty, but that corridor moment dragged the two back together. He could accept distance. He could accept silence. What he could not accept was the idea that people linked to Harry might still be moving through private circles while the monarch was left to discover it afterward. The discreet note became the turning point. A security file, which is a protected record used to track access concerns and sensitive incidents, mentioned the corridor conversation in careful language. It did not shout. It did not accuse. But it named the friend. And when Charles later saw that same name connected to the guest who appeared at the private dinner, the old warning returned with brutal force. William made the same connection quickly. The prince knew his father was not reacting to one unexpected guest. The future king understood that the dinner had reopened the exact concern raised at St. George's Chapel. Same circle, same shadow, same question. Who was keeping the path open? Charles entered that dinner carrying the memory of the file, the corridor, and the side entrance. The king saw the friend inside and felt the hidden trigger snap into place. The room was no longer a family gathering. It had become a test of control. By the time the king stepped inside that evening, he was not seeing a guest, he was seeing the return of a breach. The room did not erupt. That was what made it terrifying. Charles did not shout at first. He looked across the table, fixed his eyes on Harry's close friend, and asked one question in a voice so controlled it frightened everyone nearby. "Who allowed you inside?" The answer never came cleanly. A chair moved. A glass was set down. Then the king ended the evening with a decision no one could soften. Charles knew the private dinner had already moved too far for this mistake to feel small. Guests were gathering near the table. The mood had been carefully prepared, and the evening was supposed to prove that the family could still hold quiet moments without the outside world tearing them apart. A private dinner, in simple terms, meant a closed royal meal where trust mattered more than ceremony. That was why the friend's presence cut so deeply. He was not standing at the edge, he was near the inner circle. The king did not look away. He had seen the same name before, tied to the corridor conversation, tied to the file, tied to the fear that Harry's world still had a hidden path into royal rooms. The monarch felt the old wound open again. Not loudly, not wildly, quietly. And that made it worse. He was not only asking how the friend entered, he was asking who inside the palace believed they had the right to let him in. Harry's close friend tried to stay composed. His shoulders remained steady, but his face tightened when Charles challenged him directly. The friend understood that this was no polite royal discomfort. This was accusation wrapped in control. He gave an answer, but it did not land cleanly. It sounded careful, too careful. And the more he tried to explain, the more dangerous the silence became. Camilla did not move. She did not speak. The queen consort knew every eye in the room was measuring her reaction, searching for guilt, surprise, or fear. She had not created the moment, but she was trapped inside it. If she looked shocked, people would wonder why. If she looked calm, they would wonder more. So she stayed still, and that stillness became its own kind of pressure. A senior aide stepped forward, hoping to soften the damage. Charles stopped him with one small raised hand. A senior aide, simply meaning a trusted royal staff member who helps manage private events, was normally expected to step in during awkward moments. But the king would not allow management. He wanted the truth, not smoothing. He asked who authorized the invitation, and no one answered with confidence. The first formal toast never happened. Charles ended the evening before anyone could pretend the room was still safe. The king canceled the dinner, not as a burst of temper, but as a clear warning. The friend had entered. The list had failed. The palace had been exposed. Camilla felt the cold meaning of it. The queen consort watched the room empty, knowing the question would not die with the dinner. Harry's close friend had become the spark, but the real fire was elsewhere. And inside the palace, doors do not open by accident when power is watching every hinge. Power inside the monarchy is not always carried by crowns. Sometimes it sits in seating plans, invitation lists, private approvals, and the quiet authority of people who know which names should never appear. After the cancellation, Charles did not ask for explanations in public. He asked for the list. And when the final dinner register reached his hands, the king saw what everyone feared. Something had been changed. Charles read the pages alone, and the quiet around him became heavier than accusation. The dinner list, in simple words, was the approved record of every person allowed into that private royal evening. It mattered, because royal access is never casual when the monarch is present. One added name can become a breach. One hidden change can turn a family meal into a question of control. The king traced the names with cold focus. He saw the version his office had cleared. Then he saw the secondary version, the one that carried the name connected to Harry's close friend. The difference was small on paper, but enormous in meaning. Someone had handled the list after approval. Someone had known the guest should not be there. Someone had allowed the door to open anyway. William entered shortly after, and the silence told him everything before his father did. The prince had seen Charles angry before, but this was different. The monarch was not raging. He was measuring the damage. That frightened the future king more than any raised voice, because it meant his father was no longer reacting emotionally. He was thinking like a ruler who had found weakness inside his own walls. Charles placed the revised list flat on the desk without speaking. The king did not need to explain why it mattered. Palace protocol, meaning the basic rules that control who enters royal spaces and how private events are approved, had been broken. That protocol protected more than dinner etiquette. It protected privacy, family safety, and the thin line between personal grief and public scandal. William looked at the altered version and understood the danger. The prince knew Harry's close friend had become the visible part of a hidden chain. The friend was not the deepest problem. The deeper problem was the person who moved his name into the room. That meant the breach was not standing outside the palace. It was already inside. Charles ordered a quiet internal review. The review, a private investigation inside the royal household, was meant to find who changed the list and why the change was hidden. The king wanted no dramatic announcement. He wanted facts. But the calmness of the order made it more dangerous, because everyone involved knew the monarch had moved from shock to consequence. William stayed firm beside him. The future king believed the family could survive pain, but not weakness disguised as kindness. He saw the altered list as proof that emotional ties to Harry were still being used by people who thought the old rules no longer applied. Charles closed the file at last, but the decision had already begun. The dinner was over. Harry's friend had left. Yet the first person to feel the cost would not be the guest who entered. The dinner was over, but the punishment had only begun moving through the corridors. By morning, the cancellation had become more than a ruined dinner. It was a signal. Staff who had spoken casually the night before now lowered their voices. Doors closed faster. Phones were answered with shorter sentences. Charles had not made a public announcement, but everyone inside knew the meaning of his decision. The king believed a private boundary had been crossed, and he would not allow it to be crossed twice. Charles moved quickly, but not loudly. The king ordered palace staff to review every access record from the evening of the cancelled dinner. An access record, in simple words, is the written or digital trail showing who entered a royal space and who approved them. That mattered because the friend had not appeared out of thin air. Someone had opened the path. Someone had treated a sensitive family event like an ordinary gathering. Camilla felt the change before anyone explained it to her. After the first briefing, the queen consort sat alone, troubled by how quickly suspicion had spread through the residence. She knew palace silence could be more damaging than public noise. If one person was being questioned, everyone felt watched. If one name had been hidden, every old connection suddenly looked dangerous. William reacted with controlled anger when the first details reached him. The prince did not shout. He spoke with the cold edge of someone who had reached the end of patience. He said the family could not keep pretending old channels were harmless, because every private link to Harry now carried public risk. The future king understood the pain behind that truth, but he also understood the danger of ignoring it. Charles listened to the briefing without softening. The king learned that the guest had been cleared through a less formal route, usually reserved for familiar contacts who were not expected to cause concern. That route had once made palace life easier. Now it looked reckless. The monarch saw the weakness immediately. Familiarity had become the cover. Comfort had become the breach. The aide who admitted it did so in a recorded internal conversation, making the confession impossible to smooth away. A briefing, meaning a private update given to senior royal figures so they can make decisions, had become the first real proof that the dinner failure was not just emotional, it was operational. The system had trusted the wrong shortcut, and Charles knew shortcuts around royal privacy could destroy more than one evening. Camilla understood the order before it was written. The queen consort knew the king would now draw a harder line around anyone connected to Harry, and he did. Charles ordered that no friend tied to his younger son could attend private royal gatherings without direct approval from the monarch himself. It was simple. It was severe. It was final. William accepted the rule, but the prince also knew rules could not heal the wound beneath them. The future king saw his father standing between love and duty, between grief and control. Harry was absent, yet his shadow still shaped every decision. Charles had stopped the dinner. The king had tightened the doors. But one thing remained untouched. The truth no order could speak for him. And when the institutional noise finally faded, Charles found himself facing the one conversation he could not delegate. The turning point did not happen in a grand chamber. It happened in a private room with no aides, no briefing papers, and no one to soften the silence. William stood across from Charles and chose his words carefully. He did not speak as an advisor first. He spoke as a son. The cancelled dinner had exposed something larger than a guest list. It had exposed how much pain Harry's absence still carried. Charles did not rush to explain himself. The king had already ordered the review, already tightened the doors, already made it clear that no friend linked to Harry could pass into private royal space without his direct approval. But now the monarch faced something rules could not settle: governance, meaning the way royal decisions are managed and protected, could control access. It could not remove grief. William understood that before his father said a word. The prince had watched the dinner become a crisis, and the crisis become a warning. He knew why the decision mattered. If the palace allowed emotional back channels to stay open, then every private meal, every family gathering, and every quiet room could become vulnerable. But he also knew Charles was not only angry. The future king could see the sadness beneath the crown. Charles stayed silent for a long moment, and that silence revealed more than a speech could. The king had seen Harry's close friend, and felt his younger son's shadow enter the room. Not Harry himself, not his voice, not his apology. Just the reminder of everything unresolved. That was what had struck the monarch so deeply. The friend had not only crossed a doorway, he had crossed into a wound. William softened, but only for a breath. The prince spoke carefully, telling his father that grief could not be allowed to govern the monarchy. Governance, he reminded him, demanded distance from pain when the future of the crown was at risk. The future king did not dismiss the hurt. He respected it, but he made one thing clear. The family could not be emotionally manipulated through hidden paths and familiar faces. Charles heard the warning. The king knew his son was right, even if the truth cut him. The dinner cancellation had been necessary because trust had been broken. But it had also been painful, because it proved how far the family had fallen from simple reconciliation. The monarch had not cancelled a meal. He had admitted, without saying it publicly, that the old family circle could no longer be trusted without guarded doors. William did not celebrate that admission. The prince carried it with quiet resolve, knowing victory inside the palace often feels like loss. He had helped protect the crown, but he had also watched his father accept a colder truth about Harry. Charles finally accepted the shape of the decision. The king would not turn back. He would not soften the rule, but he would not make the response cruel either. That private acceptance shaped everything that followed. What began behind a closed door was about to become a national conversation, and the public would seize on one unforgettable image. By the next morning, the private dinner was no longer private. The image that captured the country was not a photograph from inside the room, but a newspaper front page showing an empty long dining table beneath the headline, "Dinner stopped at the door." Broadcasters repeated the phrase all day. Crowds gathered near Buckingham Palace, not loudly, but curiously, as if waiting for the monarchy to explain a silence everyone could feel. Charles knew the story had escaped before the palace could shape it. Palace circles had confirmed enough for the outside world to understand the shock. The king had cancelled a private dinner, after spotting Harry's close friend inside. Palace circles, in simple words, means the trusted staff, contacts, and royal sources close enough to know what happened before the public does. That mattered because once those circles began speaking, silence no longer protected the crown. It made the story louder. The king did not give a public speech. He let the decision stand on its own. But broadcasters quickly framed the cancellation as a harder royal line around private access, and that framing cut deep. Private access, meaning permission to enter personal royal spaces away from public duty, had suddenly become the center of national debate. Charles was no longer seen only as a father hurt by Harry's shadow. He was seen as a monarch defending the locked rooms of the crown. Harry was absent, yet he dominated every conversation. His friend became a substitute for the son who was not there, and that made the public reaction more emotional. Some viewers saw Charles as wounded, a father forced to protect himself from another hidden path back to pain. Others saw the king as severe, a monarch turning one unexpected face into a royal warning. The split made the story impossible to ignore. William watched the coverage with tight control. The prince understood why the public was divided, but he also knew what the headlines could not fully explain. The future king had seen the altered list. He had heard the quiet admission about the less formal route. He knew the issue was not simply dinner manners. It was trust, access, and the dangerous belief that old connections could bypass new boundaries. Charles heard one phrase repeated across morning coverage. The night a family dinner became a constitutional warning. A constitutional warning, in plain language, meant a private family moment had started to look like a serious test of royal authority. The king did not enjoy that phrase, but he understood it. The monarch had acted because the monarchy could not survive if private doors became emotional shortcuts. Camilla felt the pressure in a different way. The queen consort knew crowds near Buckingham Palace were not only waiting for answers, they were watching for weakness. She understood that when the public senses silence, it fills the empty space with suspicion. And suspicion, inside a royal crisis, can become more damaging than fact. Charles remained steady as the noise grew. The king had already reached the verdict behind closed doors. The world saw scandal, but he saw something colder, the final proof that private trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up. In the end, the cancelled dinner was not about one guest, one list, or one ruined evening. It was about a monarchy learning that blood ties do not automatically restore trust, and private rooms cannot survive public wounds forever. Charles made his decision because he believed the crown had been tested inside its own walls. William understood it, Camilla felt it, and Harry's shadow remained, even without his voice. Charles reached his final conclusion with a sadness no crown could hide. The king no longer saw the cancellation as an overreaction. He saw it as a necessary boundary after the earlier corridor trigger and the altered guest access. A royal boundary, in simple words, is the line that decides who may enter private royal spaces and under what authority. That line mattered because the monarchy cannot function if personal emotions are allowed to slip through locked doors without permission. William accepted the outcome with quiet resolve. The prince knew his father had not acted from cruelty. He had acted from protection. The future king understood that the dinner had revealed a weakness in palace trust, not merely a failure in planning. Harry's close friend had become the face of the breach, but the real wound was deeper. Someone had believed the king's private space could still be entered through old loyalty. Camilla felt the emotional cost of that truth. The queen consort knew the palace had grown colder after the cancellation, but she also knew why. Private gathering rules were tightened, and direct royal approval became essential for sensitive guests. Sensitive guests, meaning people whose presence could create family or public tension, could no longer be cleared through soft channels or familiar favors. The king had closed that door. Charles chose dignity over revenge. The monarch did not turn the moment into a public attack on Harry. He did not name his son as the enemy. He did not use the friend's presence to reopen every wound in front of the country. That restraint mattered. It showed that the king could defend the crown without destroying the last emotional bridge to his younger son. William saw the strength in that choice. The prince understood that punishment would have been easier than restraint, and anger would have been easier than control. But the future king also knew the message had to be clear. Family affection could remain, but access had to be earned. Love could exist, but it could not override trust. Charles accepted the pain of that final verdict. The king had cancelled a dinner, but in truth, he had ended an illusion. The illusion that the family could return to old habits without facing old wounds. The illusion that Harry's absence meant his influence had disappeared. The illusion that private loyalty could be trusted without proof. Camilla understood the new reality. The queen consort felt the chill of it, but she also understood the clarity. The monarchy emerged colder, yes, but stronger in its boundaries. The king had drawn a line, and this time, he did not step back from it. There was no final question left hanging, only the heavy truth that one cancelled dinner had drawn a line through the royal family. And this time, the king did not step back from it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.